Hello and welcome to Wholistic Hounds YouTube channel. My name is Morgan and I'm a holistic animal caretaker from the Pacific Northwest. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about, is raw meat really good for pets? So we're going to be discussing the pros and cons of feeding a raw meat diet to cats and dogs. So I wanted to start off by saying that I have been studying both canine and feline nutrition for the last about 5 years. So I wanted to talk today about, first I wanted to talk about the pros of feeding raw meat to pets. So recently there's been a big kind of craze with feeding raw meat to pets. And so it can be seen as a really good thing because we have learned that kibble is highly processed and is devoid of nutritional value. And so basically, it's the equivalent of eating maybe cereal for humans every single day. And so these kibbles that are on the market, a commercial pet food, are highly processed. They're usually highly genetically modified, so lots of corn, wheat, and soy that is genetically modified, which is not healthy. So let's talk about the pros of feeding a raw meat diet to pets. So whether we're talking cats or we're talking dogs, the pros of feeding a raw food diet, one of them would be that it's healthier than kibble. The reason why raw food is in general healthier than kibble is because it's less processed. Kibble is cooked at extremely high temperatures, and that does take away the nutritional value of the food. So one of the pros of feeding a raw meat diet is the fact that it's less processed and that it's fresh, which means that it is usually, depending on the quality, a step above kibble. And so those are the main pros to feeding a raw meat diet. And a lot of people claim that their animals, specifically their dogs and their cats, have been on a raw meat diet for years and seem to thrive. And so before I go into the cons, I wanted to share a story about feeding my own pets raw meat and what happened with that. So I have 3 cats. They're all domestic short hairs. And when we first got our cats, we fed them a high quality kibble. And I believe it was like Redford brand, Redford Naturals brand, I think it was. And we thought we were doing good because we weren't feeding Purina. We were feeding, a step above the lower grade kibble to our 2 cats that we originally started out with. And then we got our 3rd cat, who was an orphan, and she was rescued at only 1 day old. And I took care of her and nursed her and all that, helped her go to the bathroom, all that fun stuff. So what happened was one of our older cats, her name is Luna, she developed urinary crystals. It was partially because of stress, but it was also because of the food she was being fed. So we were feeding kibble. We left it down like I was taught as a kid with my house cats. And eventually my cat developed urinary crystals. She was urinating outside of the litter box. And eventually we started to see crystals in her urine. And so this was a really big red flag, and we took her to the vet. So I realized that part of the reason why my cat became sick and got this UTI and these urinary crystals was from the kibble that we were feeding, as well as the tap water that we were giving our cats access to. So we switched them over to raw food. So we were feeding the brand Primal, and we were feeding the raw rabbit, and we were feeding raw turkey. And our cats did absolutely amazing on it. They had more energy. Luna's urinary problems completely went away, and they didn't return after we switched the diet, and she was on antibiotics for a short period of time. So I noticed that they had more energy, their fur was softer, and they really, really loved the food. It was only occasionally that we'd see some vomiting, and that was pretty much it. But for cats, on a raw like rabbit recipe where it's like the Primal brand is primarily organic ingredients, they claim that the meat doesn't have any added hormones and that sort of thing. And so that can be a really great option if you can afford it, because honestly the rabbit became pretty expensive. So it was about $40 for one bag. And when you have 3 cats, that's a lot. So we were feeding raw and we were feeding organic canned food as well. And so that's kind of a story to go along with the pros. That organic, if you're getting high quality raw food for cats, especially, that it can be helpful. But now I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the cons of feeding a raw meat diet. So the quality of the meat is in question. So the majority of commercial raw meat diets formulated for pets are not organic meat. If you're sourcing a higher quality product, then usually they'll try to make the extra things organic, like if there's maybe fruit and vegetables, then maybe those might be organic, like the brand Primal, for example. But most of the raw meat on the market is not organic. The quality is in question. And so a lot of times for pets, we're feeding what is called feed grade. And for humans, it would be more of a food grade. So feed grade ingredients aren't always the best quality. And a lot of times they're kind of the remnants from the slaughterhouse, the stuff that is not fit for human consumption. And then so now some of the companies are saying, okay, well, we're using human grade meat and it's in a USDA, and this is from the US, inspected facility. But what's been going around lately, and especially for cats, is the avian influenza, so the bird flu. And it's a controversial thing because we're not really sure um, if the information we're being given is totally accurate. But basically, in multiple different states, there has been recalls for raw meat for cats, specifically cats that have died from eating a raw poultry, essentially, or raw cow's milk. So that would be a big con, obviously, of feeding a raw meat diet to a cat, for example, with the quality of the meat being in question. Because we understand that, at least for cats and for a lot of breeds of dogs, that their natural diet is something that's raw, is prey. So it would make it seems to make sense that a raw meat diet would be the answer, but it's actually not, because of the quality of the meat. So a lot of the meat that's being used is contaminated with hormones. The animals are usually being fed very low quality feed, so it's usually GMO feed that these animals that are then being slaughtered are eating. And so that um, it creates a accumulation of toxins in the meat, specifically in the fat and the organs of the animal. And so you always, when you're feeding a raw meat diet, you want to get as organic as you possibly can. If you're able to do human grade, and I don't mean human grade from a pet company, I mean like going to the store and buying organic human grade meat and then using that to formulate your animal's meals. So obviously you might need the help of a nutritionist for that. But so another thing that I wanted to share about a con of feeding raw meat to pets is this sustainability factor. So we're kind of in a time in our evolutionary history where feeding raw meat in excessive levels to animals is not sustainable for the planet at all whatsoever. And so again, this is a bit of a controversial topic at the moment because we're experiencing extreme weather conditions. We're experiencing many negative side effects from factory farming. So when I'm saying that raw meat isn't sustainable, I'm talking about factory farming, and I'm also talking about the quality of the meat. So if the animals are eating a raw meat diet, and this raw meat is very low quality. The animals that were slaughtered were eating very low quality food, and it's also raw. And so a lot of situations, there's still bacteria, potentially viruses within that meat. And so when your animal, your dog or your cat eats that, and then when they defecate, they are shedding some of that bacteria into their feces and usually into the environment. If you're not, hopefully you're cleaning up your dog's poop from outside if you are feeding a raw diet, because it can put the environment at risk, right? And it's because of the low quality of the meat. It's because of the hormones, the antibiotics, the pesticides, the heavy metals, etc., that end up being in the final product of the meat. And as far as sustainability, we are in a time where more and more human beings are taking a more plant-based approach to their diet because of the sustainability of our planet. Now is not the time to be increasing our meat intake or our dairy intake. Now is the time to be decreasing that. And so I will share another story with you about my dog, who I had previously had on a raw diet, who she got very sick from it. And so this is not intended to scare anybody, but it's just intended to say that raw meat for pets is not always the answer. In some cases, it can be very helpful. In some cases, it's better than kibble, but it's not the one all be all. So, and I'll just share this quickly before we finish up. But so my dog, her name is Jade. She's currently about 13 years old, and she's a yellow Labrador Retriever mixed with an Airedale Terrier. And I rescued her about 3 years ago, and we slowly transitioned her from the food that she was eating, which was very low quality kibble and canned food, like pretty much bottom of the barrel stuff. And I slowly transitioned her. So I continued feeding her food that she was given at her other house. And I gradually gave her healthier, more fresh foods. And at one point, I was under the assumption that raw meat was the answer and that this was going to help her. But what ended up happening is my dog got extremely ill from eating the raw meat diet. I wasn't even giving her the full amount. I was giving her about half the amount that it said to give her in a day, because I was feeding her a homemade supplemented diet and meat-based. And then I was also feeding her about half the portion of raw meat. And I did do it gradually. I gave it to her gradually, and she was very sick from the beginning of eating it, to the point where she was vomiting. She had diarrhea. She would refuse to eat the food. And all these sorts of things just kept happening. And so I realized that I should take her off the raw meat. And eventually she was switched over into like a plant-based homemade diet, because she was having a lot of food intolerances to the meat itself. Even when we were giving her organic, homemade, human grade turkey, for example, she was still very sick. And so that would be another con of the raw meat diet. It's not always suitable for animals that are seniors, for dogs that have underlying health problems. It can cause gastrointestinal distress. It can cause diarrhea, vomiting. It sometimes could even cause parasite infestations. So this is really just to sum everything up. And now my dog is a lot healthier, and she's actually on a plant-based diet. And so it's a controversial topic, but this is the diet that works for my dog based on her health problems, her history, the bioaccumulation of toxins in her body, and the way her body is responding to some of these meat products, dairy products. And even sometimes she has an issue with wheat, and that's all because of the previous diet that she was eating. So to kind of sum everything up, raw meat diets are not the answer in every situation for every cat and dog. So like with my cats, they did pretty good on the organic rabbit, but we don't feed them organic. We don't feed them raw anymore, just because of what's going on with the bird flu, and specifically with poultry. and with them potentially being vaccinated with mRNA vaccines. And so my cats now are on a half homemade organic turkey and then half organic canned food. Um, so really, to sum everything up, raw meat may be healthier than kibble in a lot of cases, but for some animals, it's not the answer. So, in dogs that are on a raw meat diet can still develop cancer, for example, and that's because of the quality of the meat being given. And so, we'll talk in later videos about more about nutrition for cats and dogs, and we'll dive more deeply into this topic. But overall, raw meat may be a step above kibble, and you may be able to give your dog small amounts of organic raw meat as kind of a topper and an extra nutritional profile for your animal. However, some animals may not respond well to being fed raw meat all the time. It's not sustainable for the planet. The quality is usually not there. If you are going to source raw meat diet for your pets, make sure the meat is organic, make sure all the ingredients are organic, and that's the best bet you have of doing it the right way. But overall, raw meat isn't always the best for our pets. And it can be sad for some of us to realize that a homemade cooked diet is absolutely the healthiest thing that you can do for your pets. And that's because you're using human grade ingredients. You know where everything is sourced. Like what I do, I incorporate energy healing into my meat preparation for my cats. So I use organic turkey, and I infuse that with healing energy so that the animals that were killed for that meat are offered a light of love, and that can increase the nutritional profile for the cats as well. And so it's just something to consider. It is the year 2025, and we are transitioning into a more sustainable way of eating. And so cats absolutely need meat. I would not recommend putting a cat on a plant-based diet unless you have the help of a holistic veterinarian. But when it comes to dogs, they can thrive and do really well on a plant-based diet, especially if meat-based diets give them issues. So overall, raw meat is not always the answer for pets. It can be amazing for some animals, and it can really help their health improve, but it's not always the one all be all. So it's just something to keep in mind. So is raw meat really good for pets? That's going to depend on a lot of different factors. But for what I'm going to say for this video is that raw meat is not always the best for pets unless it's absolutely organic and the highest quality that you can find. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll have an opportunity to talk more about nutrition for cats and dogs at a later time. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments below. And otherwise, if you'd like more information about me and what I do, you can visit my website. That's www.holistichounds, and that's holistic with a W, holistichounds.dog. All right, bye for now, and we'll see you next time.